All right, let's get started. It looks like, as always, we got a couple. Wow, that's a lot of people. Great. Wow, thanks everybody for coming out. Still a couple of people joining. Okay, let's go ahead and get started then. Tonight's webinar, depending where you are, is part of the new Coaching with WKO4 series. The last one I did about model testing and testing protocols to maintain the model. What I'm trying to do in these WKO4 series is do something that's more process orientated. We already have a group of longer webinars that really go into the physiology and the formats of training. And in this Coaching with WKO4 series, I'm just trying to give a little bit of deeper insight into a more compartmentalized process of coaching. So the first one was on testing protocols. The second one, this one, is on interval targeting. Excuse me, I get this question a lot. You know, I'm building intervals, and how hard should I go? How long should I go for? In this webinar, I'm not going to get into here's the best intervals to be doing at this time of the year. I'm going to specifically focus on the topic of targeting for intervals. So if I'm building intervals, I'm not going to say what intervals you should be doing, but I'm going to give insight into the principles and process of building intervals themselves. I really encourage you to ask questions as we go. You can simply use this little arrow here to open and close the little control panel, the GoToWebinar control panel. If you have to ask a question, just find the audio section, open it, and you can see enter a question for staff here. I have another screen going, so I'm watching questions as I go. As you know, I enjoy it if you ask the questions as they occur. I do always find it hard to come back a half an hour later and say, hey, you remember that question you asked? Here's the answer. So I'll try to answer them or build them right into the presentation as I go, so feel free to roll them out there. Don't forget that this is my opinion, and this is my opinion using WKO4. I always encourage coaches to go out and learn and develop their own coaching knowledge and their own coaching process. I don't believe in this dogmatic approach to there's only one way of coaching. So understand this is my opinion and thought. You might agree or disagree. Just giving you some insights into the way I do things. I have 3 simple session objectives. I'm going to talk about what, why, and how. As a matter of fact, I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about how and only a little bit about what and why. Before we kick off, I'm going to give you this idea of the secret interval weapon, right? People ask me all the time, like, what's the secret of interval, of building great intervals, of doing great interval work? What's that secret weapon? What number, what intensity, power duration curve, whatever? This is the secret weapon, right? I think the thing that on all of this power training, and look, I'm a data coach myself, as we all know, right? And a heavy data user. Don't lose sight, right, that the athlete feel is really important when we begin to think about not only the design on paper of intervals, but how that gets applied and how they conduct, how they do those workouts. I think it's really important that we continue to interact and get subjective data from athletes, you know, as they perform. The same athlete doing 1-minute intervals versus 3-minute intervals versus 20-minute intervals is going to have different feelings and different fatigue and different capabilities. You as a coach have to always take that in mind. I'm going to go through the next, who knows, probably a couple hundred slides, right? And I'm going to boil it down to some numbers and some principles of targeting and this and that. But you as the coach, don't forget, it really is about the athlete's feelings. When an athlete starts with power, I always say, ride with power, feel your effort and watch the number. And then you kind of start riding to that number. But as the athlete matures, they eventually become to feel the number. They know when they're going 200 watts versus 400 watts versus 600 watts. Athletes' feelings are highly relevant in this. Don't lose sight of that. It really is the secret weapon. If you're prescribing and doing everything right, their subjective feedback is the difference maker in how to ongoing apply intervals. All right, let's talk about the what a little bit. What are you targeting, right? When we say targeting of intervals, we tend to think in its simplest form, power, right? Oh, more power. I'm going to target power. The reality is there's a lot more things in targeting than just that. And you kind of probably do this anyway. Excuse me while I take a drink. You're probably doing this anyway, but there's 6 elements of targeting, right? Purpose, modality, duration, intensity, recovery or relief, depending on what you call it, and the frequency series. How many intervals, how much time at interval are you doing? So that's something that when you start thinking about targeting, all of those are targeted. All of those, are something that you're purposely making decisions and implementing a solution for. Purpose, you might say, is the overarcher, right? But I put it on the list. It keeps it clean and easy. Why do intervals? You really want to get training right. And the reality of getting training right is that simple, right? You want to produce the highest amount of adaptive strain versus the lowest amount of fatigue. So if you ride your bike every day and you just go ride around, we all know you're going to get pretty fit, but you're also pretty safe, right? If you're riding at, mid-zone 2 or whatever number you're riding at, it's pretty hard to create too much fatigue that you don't adapt. I mean, don't get me wrong, you could ride 20 hours a day, you'll struggle. But if you were to ride 3 to 5 hours a day, even in low zone 2, you're really not that dangerous to yourself. Meaning you're not going to really overtrain, you're not going to create some high level of fatigue where you're doing damage or more than you should. You're also not going to peak. You're not going to produce the highest level of stress and strain and therefore the highest level of adaptation. You're riding around with moderate power. You're very safe. You're going to produce moderate results. Intervals, even aerobic intervals, are the movement towards this idea of creating the highest amount of adaptive strain, always dampened by the lowest amount of fatigue. Second, you need specificity of the adaptive strain. You need to send the right signal. And the reality is, when you do intervals, and part of that targeting purpose, right, is you don't just want to get in shape. You don't want to just get faster, even though those are obviously 2 overarching goals. You tend to have a highly specific idea of something, some type of faster, some type of shape, whatever that is you want to accomplish, right? And you want to send that right signal. And finally, and this is really, as I always say in my webinars, like there's certain points like you really should write down this point. You want to understand that the targeting of the interval workout has a major effect on the training rhythm, on the cycle efficacy. So what I think happens in too much interval training, right, and I hear people discuss it this way, is we focus on one workout. And I'm going to tell you something right now. The secret to really good training, and if you want to call it really good interval training or really good training as a whole, is to stay focused on the forest, not the trees. The reality is you have to think, I never think about an interval training session as just a one. Don't get me wrong, I write that as one workout, but I'm always thinking of groups of, when I'm thinking of intervals, I'm thinking about the whole cycle. Somewhere a group between, let's call it 6 to 8 intervals, right? And the reality is why it's so important is as you begin to add more and more intensity or more intense interval training into your cycles, typically, after some base fitness, and I'm actually going to go over that in a moment, they are more interrelated to the adaptive signal and the resulting fatigue than just riding around or endurance based building, meaning you could overdo 1 or 2 sets of intervals, right? Create way too much fatigue and stop the adaptative, I'm having a hard time talking today, signal for a whole cycle. That's a little over dramatic, but yeah, technically you could. So understanding that every time you're targeting an interval, it's not just that workout that you're targeting, you're thinking how that targeting, the purpose of that targeting and the modality of that targeting, how it fits with, and the frequency, right, of how it fits within the whole cycle. I'm going to give you another quick secret number or a secret tip, and I'll just get this one out of the way. When you look at all these different intervals we do, right, research after research after, and this is a generalization, shows that the results, the interval modality and the exact precision of the interval matters less than you think. Results can be similar, the same with different types of intervals and different modalities and stuff like that. As long as you're doing, some hard work and some easy work, there's some basic premise that's generally correct to it. The results are the same. Where the difference gets made in interval training is in the whole cycle. It's in the forest. It's not the individual tree. But yet people search for that perfect interval workout, that exactly perfect workout. And it really hurts your approach towards interval training. There is no perfect interval workout. They're all pretty good. They all do some different things that are positive, right? What you need to do is understand the overarching rhythm. Now I'm going to teach you one workout. That's why I'm so saying it early and getting that little soapbox off. But the reality is you always have to think how it fits within the cycle. And the final point is this, right? When you turn to higher intensity interval training, most of your gain will come in the first 6 to 8 interval workouts. So it's really important you get them right. So if you've been generally just riding zone 2 all winter long and that was your base training, and I'm just making this too black and white, but you'll get the idea. And you're just riding zone 2 all base training, and then suddenly you're 8 weeks out from your event and you flip the switch and I want to start getting ready to race right now, and you're doing intervals 2 to 3 times a week. It's those first 6 to 8 intervals that are really going to drive all of the response, 90% of that response. So those are the ones you want to get right and have planned right. It's that first cycle and a half, 2 cycles, that really matter once you go to interval training. So you don't want to get it wrong. You want to get it right. What are you trying to do? It's pretty simple when we talk about intervals, right? You want higher power, more, or you want to hold power longer, or you need to create some type of specific performance. I need to accomplish a highly specific function within a performance event, within a race, within a something. So you're usually doing one of those 3. Now there's others, and there's other things that you might fit underneath this, fatigue resistance and stamina. You might say, muscular development, but they all fit within these 3. That's the 3 things you're looking to accomplish. And finally, kind of thinking about the what and the why. This is an old chart. It's out of Training and Racing with a Power Meter. Andy did it. It's been around for like 15, 20 years now. And it's based on his classic training levels, as you can see. And you know what? It's still as good today as it was then. Andy, is always so good at having a clear understanding of the physiology, clearly as a physiologist, but also the application and function here. So if you want to think about all these different intervals and using different training zones and how to do it, go back to this chart. The presentation, by the way, I loaded it. You can download it right out of the control panel as a shared document. And if not, if you can't figure out how to do it, just email me after the presentation and I'll send it to you. I'm not going to go over this. Everybody can look at it. The more X's, the better, right? Excellent chart by Andy. Really gives good overview of why I do intervals. All right, let's jump into the how of it all. Sorry, I'm taking one more drink. I think I might be catching a cold. Oh no. Let's get into the how of intervals, right? The hardest thing about doing process webinars where you're trying to show somebody your process is, think about all your processes, right? You usually don't write them out. So you have to kind of formalize how you think about things. So this is my workflow. I always end up doing it as a workflow, like what order, how, what's the chronological approach that I take towards the work. So when I start thinking about, interval training or planning an interval workout, I do start strategic. I don't escape it. Even a tactical webinar like I'm doing here, I can't avoid strategic. You always see forest. And strategic side, I want the purpose and the modality. And I'm going to explain each one of these. So in the strategic side, I'm thinking full season plan, the athlete's needs analysis based on the ability of the rider, demand of the event, and a desired outcome. I see too many people are like, oh, I'm doing these cool intervals from this online program or that online program. And I say, why? And they're like, they're cool. Well, cool doesn't make you faster. It might or might not, but you really need to understand the why. You got to have say, and the why is the desired outcome. If I do this, if I invest energy into this intervals, what do I expect to gain when I'm done? And as everybody here knows, you don't gain it immediately. There's some time and some ongoing training, but you get my point. Second, we get into the more tactical stuff. Interval duration and intensity. How hard, how long? Relief, duration, and intensity. How much do I rest in between and at what level? And then density series or time in zone, TIZ, time in zone, right? How many intervals do I do? And how much total cumulative time am I looking for? Here's where we're typically looking at the possible immediate demand of an athlete. And more particularly, I'm looking at power versus capacity versus specificity. There's also fatigue resistance in there that I have on my next slide. I should have added it to this slide. Athlete fitness. And this is an underrated one, so I put it here, right? One of the things that I often think about, again, going back to a more subjective approach at times, is what motivates an athlete. I have an athlete that I've coached for about 2 years now, on and off again, pro mountain biker because he keeps crashing. He hates doing 4-minute intervals, but loves doing 6-minute Tabata style intervals. And as a matter of fact, he can put out more power doing the Tabata intervals than he can the 4-minute intervals. So basically the end result is the same. Go back to my point about you would be surprised how little variation by changing up modalities, how little change the results would be. So that particular athlete is more motivated by going really hard and then taking a short break and then going really hard. He just loves it. He gets into the total attack mode and goes nuts. So if that's what motivates him, great. I'm going to do more intervals that way. Athlete motivation absolutely should play a role in the way you design and do your intervals. So let's break those things down. I'm going to kind of go right down the chart. Start with purpose. You basically, in oversimplification, whenever you're prescribing intervals, you're either raising power, you're building capacity, you're building fatigue resistance, or you're achieving some specific purpose. So I built this little chart for everybody. And I always am fearful when I do this because, again, it's not black or white. If you go to a certain 20,000 foot view, you can tend to see some patterns, right? But the reality is there's all type of outliers and exceptions. But I just put together a simple overview for everybody to think about. If you don't like it, right, and you want to invest in your own coaching, create your grid. Go take that presentation and blank out what I wrote and fill in yours, right? And you'd be surprised if you sat down for a quiet hour and started and just asked yourself, gee, what are the different ways and things I want to accomplish with intervals and how do I do them? Just thinking in advance might, utilizing your learning and your reading and other stuff and come up with your own. But here's mine. So when I look at all these, I broke them down into a couple of formats. So life cycle, right? I always think big picture first. When I think about an athlete, I rarely am ever thinking about 1 year. I tend to think in 3 to 4 year cycles. So when I think about raising power, building capacity, building fatigue resistance, and this last one the answer is always going to be specific because it's a specific thing, right? I think about this over time. So if an athlete wants to raise power, right, and this is just a life cycle thought process, most athletes see their greatest increases in power in the first 1 to 3, maybe 1 to 4 years of their training. There's a great time where, let's just say you discover a 20-year-old athlete who comes from running or didn't really ride their bike and suddenly, shows some decent talent and wants to get into it. Just know the next 1 to 3 years, that athlete is going to raise power, and you focusing on things that help them raise the power, that's the fastest side that will respond, raising power and taking a power-based approach. Building capacity, that usually comes a little bit later. As you can imagine, it really depends on how much you're training, the quality of your training, the quality of your, the lower stress of your life, all those other factors, but it tends to come later. Fatigue resistance comes even later. I should have changed that to 3 to 5 years. It is progressive to some degree. Power leads to capacity. Capacity leads to fatigue resistance. Those tend to stack on top of each other. So if you're thinking life cycle, that's how it comes. And again, specific is all about the season. So if you wanted to raise power, the preferred but not only dominant format, and again, not only would be do higher power, lower frequency intervals to raise power. If you want to raise power, it's higher power. You want to create a 1500 watt sprint, you got to train at 1480 watts, and hopefully 1500 watts and more. You got to mimic what you want to do. If you want a 700 watt 1 minute, then you got to train in those ranges. You got to do the work to get there. So you want higher power, lower frequency intervals. And I might as well say the recovery format with a long, slow recovery. So if you want to gain power, high power, lower frequency, long, slow recovery. Now, if you want to build capacity, you need medium to high power. You still got to go high, hard, medium, and hard, but you don't need to go quite as hard as when you're focused on building power. And you need medium to high frequency of intervals, but you need a short, steady recovery. So LSR and SSR in my language, right? LSR means I don't care if you stop and sit in the grass. I don't care if you coast all the way downhill. SSR typically means, for me, around 40 to 50% of FTP. You can take that note. 40 to 50% of FTP of light spinning. Don't grind up a hill or something like that. Not that you can typically at that power, but you get the point. Now, to build fatigue resistance, you can do both of these, and I'll give some examples later, both, but must define high power. So what I mean by define high power is, right, if you're raising your sprint power, I just gave the 1500 watt sprint power, right? You might be raising power 1500 watts. So what do you do to do that workout? You do 15-minute warm up, you go to your local sprint, flat or slight hill or wherever you do your sprints, and you drill it for 10, 15 seconds, and you're like, wow, I hit 1500 watts. You need to redefine in the idea of fatigue resistance. You need to change that definition to, wow, I hope I can do 1200 watts after 2000 kilojoules. Maybe my goal's on, maybe it's 1000 watts after 2000 kilojoules. So that's what I mean by you have to define high power. It's not the same high power here. It's after a certain amount of fatigue. What can I do? And fatigue resistance and using intervals at times, it's not the most physiologically, let's say you're doing 8 times 1 minute intervals, right? You'll put out higher power, way higher power here and here, doing them after a 15 to 30 minute warm up versus here after doing them after 1500 to 2500 kilojoules, depending on your race level, right? These will have more physiological effect. These might be better prepare you for success in your event. And that's so important to think about what I just said. And then you need both types of recovery. It depends what you're working on. Work interval volume. You have high power with a power progressive. And this isn't anything new. I've kind of taught this before, meaning I might say, if you're building 1 minute power or something as an example, I'd much rather focus on 5 super max, super high quality intervals than try to do 6 or 7 or 8 and you're falling apart and your pedal stroke is crap and you just can't produce power and your power is up and down and up and down. I'd much rather have it be that way. Interval volume for building capacity, medium to high value, and now your volume progressive. So I'd rather have you go from 5 1 minutes to become 6, become 7, becomes 8. I'm more interested about the progression, the time or the work, time at workload or time in zone. And again, fatigue resistance is just the same idea, just after a certain amount of work. That's building specificity or specific performance demand. You'll get a better response from doing the intervals fresh. You'll prepare yourself for performance success. If your performance success is you have to perform well at the end of a race or the end of an event, you'll prepare yourself more for that. So what are the targeted results? Power to select duration. And actually it does help you repeat high power. A lot of us can sprint really hard once, but can you do it twice or maybe 3 times? And 2 to 3 is probably all you really got. But here in capacity, it's hold power for longer durations and repeat frequency. One of the questions I get all the time is, oh yeah, I've been raising my FRC, but I don't know how it affects my repeatability. Well, 3 things affect your repeatability. 1, your FTP, right? The higher that is, the less anaerobic energy you're using. 2, your FRC. the bigger that anaerobic battery, I will absolutely tell you, the better you're going to repeat. It's very few people who have a larger FRC who don't have pretty solid repeatability, unless it's been trained to exactly that. So you can have a longer duration and repeat frequency. And fatigue, it's power at select fatigue levels. Again, when I'm talking about what do I do after 1500 kilojoules, what do I do after 2000, what do I do after 2500? And I have an example of this later. And finally, timing early in the workout. If I'm doing power, I want you as fresh as possible. 2 days ago, somebody messaged me on Facebook about they want to do these 1 minute intervals at max power, but it takes them an hour and 10 to get to the right hill. How hard should they ride that hour and 10 at? And it's like, I wouldn't ride it at all. Try just 10. Just go 10 minutes and drill it. Just enough that you're warmed up. You don't want, when you're doing a pure power work, you want to get right at it. Capacity is pretty much the same. You can go a little bit longer, but you really want to get these two workouts early in the workout, and typically after a rest day if you're thinking about the cycle when you're fresh, where fatigue resistance is late in the workout. Achieve a specific purpose, that's really determined by the event and the performance need. So that's purpose. So let's talk about modality. I said this earlier, and I know I have another slide, and actually have another slide on it later, right? Numerous studies have shown that the variation of interval modality has no significant increase in results. So if you did 7 times 3 minutes, 5 times 4 minutes, or 4 times 5 minutes, let's call those VO2 max intervals as a whole, studies show that the results are generally the same. Now, don't get me wrong, you might have other reasons for choosing the 7 times 3 over the 4 times 5, right? And that might be progression, it might be demand of the event, it might be athlete motivation. But at the end of the day, as long as they do those with quality and following a certain series of principles, they'll get the same results. They'll get the same results as if they did 4 times 4 minutes of Tabata, 20 seconds on and 10 seconds off. If you did them that modality, that's not the exact way you should do Tabata, but I think you guys get, let's call them micro, hard, easy type of approach. There is no one format that rules them all. You as the coach have to understand the athlete, know what they like and what motivates them, understand the underlying specific demands that makes you choose a specific modality. When I look at modality, and these are my names, you guys can call them what you want. Interval format, all right, that one's simple, right? Neuromuscular manipulation and fatigue status. That's how I think about modality. So let's start about format. I use the TrainingPeaks workout builder, excuse me a second, to just show some examples here. And I don't mean any specific workout. There is no secret workout on the screen. I'm just showing you interval modality types. So this is the classic steady interval approach. This is 4 times 3. The 4 is kind of too light, but all I'm really showing is your 3 minutes on, 3 minutes SSR, 3 minutes on, 3 minutes SSR, 3 minutes on, 3 minutes SSR, right? The classic steady interval. Most of us are most familiar with this format. It's the easiest to prescribe. It's the easiest to do. It also can kind of be the most boring, right? We've all done them probably on this list, a lot of VO2 max style intervals, and we've all done that. You hate this last minute type of thing, but it is what it is. It's highly effective. You have what I call mixed intervals, which you can call Tabata, micro, over-unders, and that's this. And here's an example of 3 times 6 minutes of, you always got to have a typo, of 40-20. With 4 minutes rest in between. So you're going 40 seconds hard, 20 seconds easy, 40 seconds hard, 20 seconds easy, 40 hard, 20, 40, 20, 40, 20, and that's your interval, right? Then you have your SSR, then you have your 6 minute interval. That's another modality, the mixed modality. We also then have the max modality. This is one of the things that you guys know I preach at times. Sometimes you have to take the idea of the steady modality and flip it into the max version. And max is the same write-up, the same format as the steady, except the target watts goal. If you think about the target watts goal of the steady, you're doing the highest watts you can for all the intervals. Where the max, the mental changes, you're doing the highest watts you can for each interval. And each plays a role, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. So that's the max protocol. And I'm using 3-minute intervals. It could be 1 minute, whatever. I'm just giving everyone the visual look. And finally, there's a repeated format. I added the repeated format last night because somebody asked me, so it's not in my next couple of charts. Repeated formats are where you're kind of doing a little bit of blend of mixed and steady, but you're doing it to get potentially a little bit more time in zone. So the example here is 3 times 6 minutes. So you're 6 minutes on, 3 minutes off, 6 minutes on, 3 minutes off, 6 minutes on. So you're really doing this sense, you're pushing even more capacity because you're reducing the recovery time. I'm going to show this in a little bit deeper. Then a longer rest, then you repeat a set of intervals. This is often done in a fitness building phase. So this isn't, this you might do as a bridge fitness, meaning, man, I want the athlete to do a little bit more. I'm trying to build quickly, but they can't really handle the workload yet. So by breaking down the whole interval set into 2 interval sets, you generally allow them to do more work. You have to couch that a little bit by the fact that if you really shorten the recovery, you change the whole profile of what they're doing because it becomes a mixed interval then, doesn't it? So I got a question, and I just want to be clear. Isn't variation of intervals important? So intentionally variable modalities would follow this idea. Eric, that's a great question. I'm going to answer it in a little bit. Your body wants a certain amount of mix, and this idea of a lot of mix is not true. Your body will respond best to rhythm and change versus pure variation. Now, in a strength sense, if you think about CrossFit, there is this idea of, what do they call it at strength level? Like muscular confusion, where if you just keep surprising your body with variation, it will keep adapting. The reality is the body doesn't, from one workout, is not getting maximal adaptation. So, and since I've answered it, I'll go a little deeper and I'll skip that slide, is for me, what I typically believe, your body adapts to exercise stimuli in somewhere between 4 to 8 weeks, right? And having a similar but not exactly the same pattern for about 4 weeks and then changing allows your body to get the maximal adaptation. This is the idea of training specificity falls within this realm, allows your body to have maximum adaptation within that realm. And then as soon as it starts to adapt and figure out the specific rhythm of the stimuli, then you change it. Then you go to a new rhythm of that stimuli and a new variation. Now, that doesn't mean I might prescribe every single interval is 7 times 3 minutes, right? Steady state in the steady format like I had up here, right? But I would prescribe 70 to 80% of the intervals in that cycle as very similar in format. You want to produce strain, if you think about the general adaptation syndrome, and they call it GAS, right? The first couple of intervals rings the alarm. That's what the G stands, when you're talking about the general adaptation, I'm sorry, that's what the alarm phase is. So those first couple of intervals alarm your body, say, wow, there's a new stimuli, right? And then actually the longest phase in general adaptation syndrome is known as the resistance phase. And you want to continue to introduce a similar stimuli as the body goes through that resistance phase, because those are the time frames of greatest stimuli, adaptive signal response, and your body's actually responding. Then it starts to get used and finally go into a fatigue or plateau stage, right? Then you want to make the change. That's how I do it. I saved you a slide later. Good question, though. Here's my modality summary. Remember, I didn't add repeat to last night. Sorry, I should have thought about that one. But basically, when it comes down, these are pretty much alike. So I looked at purpose, effect, and any other point I had. The reality is, if I look at the steady state, these are best for capacity building, because they maximize time at work. So if you were measuring state, let's take the 3-minute example that's kind of on the screen, and let's just say it was more than the 4 I'm showing. Let's say it's 7 times 3 minutes, right? Or 6 times 3 minutes. Say it's 7 times 3 minutes. So 21 minutes in total time on zone. So the time you're going hard. if you're measuring that against VO2 max and you're trying to achieve 90% plus of VO2 max or 95% plus of VO2 max, right? Those 21 minutes might result in 14 to 15 minutes of VO2 max time, which is an excellent amount of time to spend at VO2 max, by the way. There's a keeper. So for most of us, once you spend about 12 to 15 minutes at VO2 max, not total interval time, but time at VO2 max or power at VO2 max, you're getting a pretty good workout. Anything over 15 minutes, you're usually just hammering away fatigue. You're not going to get any more gain. Steady state intervals allow you to maximize that time because you're steady, right? And you're just, you drill it up, your heart rate follows, the strain is there, you're staying in those work zones, it maximizes time. The mixed intervals gives us a little more power and capacity. And again, remember, all the results are sort of the same. They're not all that much difference. You're talking about nuance now, probably a very important nuance, but nuance. You get a slightly better improved neuromuscular response. Now, some of the other factors between these two, right? You get higher lactate response or lactate shuttling or the utilization or buffering. There's so many lactate words you can use there actually in a steady state interval. We tend to think these raise lactate more, and there is a little bit greater spike of lactate, but when you do a steady state interval, the lactate will continue to rise in the rest. That's part of what you're buffering. And it's part of why you don't rest more than, a certain ratio, is that you want that. So it does give your body some ability to deal with that, which will improve the anaerobic response because you learn a little bit more. Your body is learning to use lactate as energy. Total oversimplification. And the reality is both of these are really similar. I'm just trying to give you a little definition. Here you have a greater or higher O2. You tend to have not only a higher neuromuscular response, you actually have a higher cardiovascular demand. So you're getting a little bit more on the oxygen intake way. Max is power. Max aerobic intensive stimuli, max aerobic demand. Why is it max aerobic? Because when you go really hard these first one or two with a controlled recovery, you basically are burning down your readily available anaerobic energy. And by your third or fourth interval, you're pretty much aerobic. You've burned off all the, I'm trying to stay away from the physiology of it all, but you've burned off your anaerobic battery. It's totally, generally almost totally depleted. It doesn't have enough time to restore in these in-between intervals. So when you're going as hard as you can these last 3 or 4, that really is heavy demand on the aerobic system, right? And I got this question last night, and I haven't had it here, but I'll answer it. And there's a lot of smart people I can see on this list who know this also. So then somebody will say, well, only those first two really produce power at VO2 max. They're only high enough above 95%. Well, the reality is that would be true if there wasn't a slow component to VO2 max or a way the fatigue happens. You could be at the same VO2 demand of these first two as these last two. Just because you're going a lot less power, it's just not that clean and linear. And that's because of the slow component fatigue. If you really want to keep it simple and clean, the fatigue of doing the max, the higher fatigue of doing these max ones up here, has you producing less power, but you're still having the same demand systematically. So don't think that these last couple are just wasting time. They're just very max aerobic intensive, right? So high stimuli. High fatigue both physiologically and psychologically, so max interval protocols should be used reasonably sparingly. But if you never go max, you're never going to go max. There's a role for it within training that coaches are often afraid, or self-coached athletes are often afraid to use. Some days you just go out and you throw it down. It just is what it is. Final interval modality, and we do this one really quick, just trying to make up a little time, is how you pedal or where you do the interval has a very big effect. So if you do on a flat or a positive grade, a climb, those obviously are two different things. So you can do high cadence flat, high cadence grade, low cadence flat, and low cadence grade, and you change the torque demands. And this is going to make sense to everybody. In torque demand, your lower torque, even a high cadence at grade, if you still can do high cadence right, the grade isn't slowing you down enough, so lower torque, maybe not as low torque as the flat, but lower torque. And once you start going uphill, low cadence on a flat, that's medium torque, and then when you go low cadence up a hill, you're typically grinding away, right? So you have high torque. High torque and low torque, you could put out the same power, right? But those demands, the muscular metabolic, the neuromuscular effect is all different. Widely different? No. Slightly different? Yes. Help with specificity? Yes. Also, what changes is your pedaling style. So if you're in a flat, right, and you're pedaling pretty hard down a really nice flat road, and you're just flying along at 25 miles an hour, 40, 45 kilometers an hour, and you stop pedaling, what happens? The bike will coast. It'll coast for a while, won't it? Well, that's because you have kinetic energy in the system, and there's no resistance working against that. But if you look at how that affects your pedaling style, you tend to just be pedaling in a maintenance style. You're very punchy. You're just 1 to 3, 1 to 3, 1 to 3. Think about a clock, and you're just maintaining speed. Now, if you're going, and you could do that at 250 watts, right? You're just cruising along. Now, let's say you take the same 250 watts and you go up a hill, a 10% grade. Now you're only going, 6 or 7 miles an hour, 10 to 12 kilometers an hour. You stop pedaling, what happens? You quickly fall over, right? Because the kinetic energy is quickly deleted or diffused. You don't have the speed, you don't have the energy built up in the system because of gravity. That changes the way you pedal when you climb. You tend to force a full circle. You're more forceful. I don't mean you're producing more force. You're still producing 250 watts, and you might produce more force because of lower cadence, but you're pedaling the full circle. So it actually changes the way you pedal. So doing 7 times 3 minutes on a flat with a higher cadence has a different muscular demand than doing 7 times 3 minutes on a climb with a low cadence. You could average 300 watts for every one of those, right? And say, oh, the demand was the same, but the reality is the demand and the resulting fatigue is not. And they're counterintuitive. Most athletes find a lower rate of perceived fatigue or perceived exertion in a low cadence, higher power outputs or higher torque outputs than they do at high cadence, lower torque outputs. Why? Most people would tell you why, because your ventral rate, how fast you're breathing in and out, is the greatest signal to your body for fatigue. So if you're breathing heavy, you think you're more fatigued. But the reality is most people see the lower cadence, higher torque as less exertion. But the residual fatigue from those is the inverse. Low cadence, high torque has higher residual fatigue, more muscular trauma in those efforts, and you recruit differently. You recruit muscle units, fibers differently. So the reality is, if you're doing some harder intervals in the winter, right, in the base training time frame, you might prescribe them with higher cadence work because you don't need the muscular force yet. You're not really building strength. You are building, aerobic fitness. Let's just say that generally. Why introduce the extra fatigue in that training cycle, right, when you can get what you want, if not more, by getting the athlete to do it higher cadence? As you move into the 8 weeks, time to get, your race game on, you might move into higher torque experiences, more force pedaling experiences as you do the interval. I'm not talking about going out and doing big gear intervals. I'm talking about how you implement, and I'll continue to use this 7 times 3 minute example to keep us on track, how you implement the actual interval modality. And finally, fatigue status is simple. I stole this from the internet. I forget who I stole it from. If you're on this meeting and I stole it from you, I'd like to say thank you. So the reality is, these 2 sprinters, I think this was 2 days ago, the stage was, they did this analysis of their last 20-second sprint. Pretty well-known sprinters, right? Pretty strong men. Average speed, 64 kilometers, basically, right? Top speed, only a little bit higher. Look at the average power for 20 seconds. And look at their max power for 20 seconds. I'll bet you money there's people on this webinar looking at that saying, I can do that power. I can hit that number, 1,240 watts. I can get that. The question is, can you do it after 2,500 kilojoules of hard work? That's the difference, right? So when you think about fatigue, people ask me all the time, like, well, what does sprinters sprint at? What's their watts? And it's like, you mean fresh, or you mean when they're really racing? So the reality is, when you think about the modality of fatigue resistance, if you have a specific demand, like you're a sprinter, you better do some of your sprints, right? Again, I'm not telling you how many or frequently or when, but you better train that ability to sprint after X kilojoules because that's the specific demand of the event. So that's that modality of fatigue. So modality tips. So if little to no difference, which do I choose? Go with the best odds. So like if you have a crit racer, the odds are that the incremental gain out of Tabata or mixed style intervals will be the best. If you have a time trial or steady state might be the best. Just play the odds. There is no perfect answer. But remember, athlete motivation to performance is a key. And that really drives the bigger motivation. You know, I was watching somebody complaining about Zwift workouts, and I would complain about them too. I got to be honest, there are some pretty bad ones on there. But on the same side, what I really like seeing is how motivated people are to do the workouts. And man, sometimes a bad workout done in a highly motivated way, I can't believe I'm about to say this, actually, I shouldn't say it, might not be bad for that athlete, might not be the worst answer, because the other worst answer is, they just didn't do the work, right? They just bagged it and spun around. So athlete motivation can be a pretty big deal. Incremental gains and specificity. That's another reason to do, like my crit example. I might crit racers, you know, doing a little more of the mixed interval style. It might get some incremental gains. And one of the important things, and I added this after yesterday's webinar, the half-life of the workout. So let's say you're going to be a crit specialist, right? And you're just starting your winter season. You're like, man, I need to work on my anaerobic side because I'm just not as great at it as I'd like to be. So you're adding an occasional anaerobic work and you're doing it super hard mixed style. You're not going to carry that fitness. The half-life of exercise is about 90 days. It's kind of why TSS is truly based off 90 days, not the 42 you think it is. So the reality is, if you're doing work more than 90 days out, the specificity of that work is not relating to the specific performance. So here's a key point. The work you should be doing there is work that's going to better enhance your ability to do that specific work that will enhance your performance when you get within 8 weeks of your event. So that's part of the progression, right? If I know 8 weeks to my event, I've got to be able to do a crap load of anaerobic workout or mixed interval or however you're going to approach it, right? I need to be doing things in the pre that 8 weeks and the pre 12 weeks that are preparing me to do more of that quality work that I specifically need when the time comes. So let's get into interval duration, intensity, how long and how hard. Intensity really is defining the relationship, and I've used this slide a million times because it's good. It's defining, this is what I do, remember, my opinion. And BJ, you made a great point just moving on from cadence. Even just changing the wheel speed and the trainer at the same cadence can affect fatigue. People don't do enough mixed cadence work on the trainer. If you participate like in our VEC or my wife's coaching company really, but our coaching company workouts and stuff like that, we do a lot of mixed cadence work. And everybody keeps saying, well, you're trying to make my cadence higher? And I'm like, no, I'm just trying to make you faster. That experiencing different stimuli and fatigue is important. So back to intensity and time. Defining the relationship of workout intensity intervals and the PD curve, right? That's what intensity is. It's simply a meeting point of intensity and the correct time. So here's your power duration curve. Intervals should be intersection points. Liam, I'll get back to that question. I'll kind of give it a season overview here in a second. But let's talk about time first. So here's what I use for time, right? Well, actually, before we talk about time and Well, here's what I use for time. Let me give you an overview of the season first. It'll go a little better this way. So I'm not going to go through, I keep saying I'm not going to go through these charts, but then you notice I do. Kind of have issues. I can't help myself. So I tried to put this together because it was so hard to think about general. I should have put across here general, because the time of interval really depends on the time of season, but yet can be changed due to a whole lot of other factors, typically related either to the immediate athlete demands or the event. But if you said physiologically, if I was going to put general rules down, right, I only believe, and I know this is sacrilege, right? Any mature athlete, most mature endurance athletes, your training season should be 20 weeks long, maybe 24, right? To a peak event or to the beginning of the season. It depends what you're doing. That's it. Now, that doesn't mean you're laying on the couch the other weeks. That's the misconception there, right? But when you're full-on structured training in a progressive, purposeful way, for most mature athletes, meaning they've ridden their bike a fair amount for a couple of years, 20 weeks is a really good starting expectation for training. They need to come into that 20 weeks with good base fitness, good cross fitness, good strength, good, well-healed from previous years, not at zero CTL, not with, like me, like the big potato chip belly that I got going on here these days. You got to come in shape and ready, in a base shape and ready to roll. Now, once we get into that training, I use the word base training in presentations, and because I don't have a better word, foundation, base, whatever. I'm not a classic periodization guy, but I do believe they're really, for being progressive, it's really a great way to express it. But I'm just 2 periods, 12 weeks of base, 8 weeks of performance. Performance is where the money-making time comes. Base training is all about getting you prepared for performance training. That's all it is. A performance training gets you ready to race out here. So I started thinking about intervals, right? So basically, I'm looking at aerobic capacity intervals. Let's call it tempo to SST. And notice I overlap these two here. Anywhere from a single 15-minute interval all the way out to 4 hours of intervals, or more. I mean, I have an athlete who rides 4 hours of tempo. It's just, if that's the demand they need, if they can, and that's the stimuli they need to create response, then that is what it is. Capacity intervals are just that. They're usually tempo work, maybe, SST. SST goes in this blurry line sort of in between here, right? It's a little bit of power, it's a little bit of capacity. Then we move later in the year to aerobic power, and here's where I'm still doing sub-threshold. We almost need a category between SST and 100%. So let's say something between 93 and 100%, right? My 95%. And those are being done as intervals of 8 to 15 minutes. And they're not like, wow, I'm trying to build super threshold or trying to absolutely jam threshold, because I'm not in that performance mode yet, but I'm setting the stage for that later. Now, I could put a whole bunch of things in here, and in hindsight, I should have, I guess, but so go back to Lynn's about big gear. If your limiter is strength, or if I would put strength. So the question, let me read the question. Would you not include very low cadence work in the base period to build general strength, then convert the specific strength in the build period, having athlete ride at preferred cadence terrain? Generally, what I do in my base training is I do high cadence in here and transition in early base, like the first 4 weeks. Then yes, I would do big gear in the middle 8. It really depends on the athlete, but remember, the first 6 to 8 workouts or intervals of that type, you'll get most of the game. So yeah, I do big gear work in there. And I could have put a line here saying big gear in here, but I do start with a cycle of high cadence first. Let's get everything spinning well and loosened up and making nice little, as best they can, circles, then go to force and then rebuild that clean little circle. I go back to a high cadence work here, and not exclusively, but that's a general idea. Now, once we go to performance training, this 8-week phase, that's where it's like, bam, we're turning on the jets. Now we want to get ready to race. So if I'm building anaerobic power, anaerobic capacity, I'm always 30 seconds to 120 seconds. I will tell you right now, for anaerobic power, I always use a select number. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to show you in a little bit. I use optimized levels. I'll tell you right now, and to optimize targeting. But I tend to like, if I was picking numbers or I don't have a good model, right around 45 seconds for anaerobic power. That's pretty much when you burn down the battery. Anything over that, you might be going a little overkill. Depends on the athlete. I want about 5 seconds of really emptying that last little bit of power. And anaerobic capacity, same 30 seconds to 120, but I like 1 minute intervals for capacity. The difference between the two is the time in between, the formats in between. This is LSR, this is SSR. LSR, SSR. And I'll show this in a chart in a moment. I'm a big believer in max aerobic power, what we traditionally call VO2 max intervals. I'll start them here in transition. That's an interval that I might start a little early depending on the athlete, but I won't, I would fade it out. I wouldn't maintain that more in the training modality and the training schedule more than 6 to 8 weeks. If you're doing a time trialist or something or some longer effort, you might use super threshold, and you might use some of these and all of these. Remember, I'm just trying to give time range thoughts. Super threshold, 8 to 15 minute intervals, but now we're going just at supra. Here would be sub, here would be super threshold. So I'm going at 102 to 105%, if not even a little bit more. Actually, oftentimes in these type of workouts and preparing for shorter time trials, you're going max. You're going max that you can do that work. And then don't ever forget that you still need a certain amount of aerobic power maintenance. Capacity will come hopefully through time and some of the harder, one long Sunday kind of deal and blah, blah, blah. But I'm talking about intervals. So I'm still going to do some of these mixed in once every 10 to 14 days if I can squeeze it in. Depends on race schedule and everything else. Now, there's all kinds of things I do because of the event or the athlete, right? It just didn't say event and athlete, but athlete limiter is something I'm working on early. I begin to switch to general event demands here through the base period. Then I become more about the specific event demands. In here, too, there's also some focus on the athlete's strengths. You might have an athlete with a strong anaerobic ability but doesn't have a great aerobic ability, and they want to be a professional road racer. So you're spending a lot of time here building the aerobic engine. Don't forget to put a little bit more anaerobic speed on top. That's still their strength. You gotta give them a little bit back. And somewhere in the midst here, depending again on the athlete, I might be working on fatigue resistance. So when we think about duration challenging, it's progressive, right? And it's part of the overarching system. And it's hard to explain. The annual planning webinar does a pretty good job of that too. And that's the type of knowledge, but just trying to give some duration. This is just another way of looking at it. 20 to 8 week countdown. My main focus is the physiological needs of the athlete. I'm more focused. I want all my intervals, whether I'm working on their limiter or whether I'm working on their strength or building aerobic. I want the intervals to have the maximal physiological effect. I want to improve the engine's ability to make horsepower, period. As I move into the 8 to 12 weeks, I'm more focused on the ability of the rider. I'm actually more focused on the demands of the event, but you can't forget how the ability of the rider fits into that, right? So, for example, I coach a pretty good time trialist. She'll never be a sprinter. So you don't want to be kind of working sprints all winter, right? And then just, she needs a little more sprint and still be working sprints here. She's not going to lose the race by sprinting, and it's not really a demand of the event at that stage. So the reality is here we really become about the event demand, the event need. How will you win, right? That's the question all your intervals should answer. How will you win? That's what you should be focused on in the total output. So I got a really good question here. How do you account for non-structured high-intensity workout races that an athlete has to do in various phases? Eric, great question. It is exactly what you just said. There's more role. When I said this interval modality, one of the things that's happening, everything's a cycle, right? We always go back to where we were. So you go all the way back to the runners with the idea of fartlek, this unstructured interval training. Just go hard for some times and go easy for some others. What we're learning that actually might be more effective than what we know. An unstructured, or you're called it non-structured, which probably is a better word when you're talking about racing, right? Because you're just simply responding to the demands of the race. That's an interval day. It's that simple. And is it a 1 minute interval or 2 minute it's an interval day. It's assuming we're generally talking about shorter racing and typically what most rec cyclists would be participating in, right? That just would simply count as a workout day, in which case I'll get to that in a moment. But in the end of the day, when it comes to duration targeting, I use optimized. I really do. It's hard for me to say I don't. It is always my general guidance. And I have a special chart pack, and I was going to load this to the library, and at the end of the day, I started not to because our library is getting too crowded. And if somebody emails me, I'll send it to you. But it's getting too many variations of the same thing. You should just simply quickly create your own variation. All I did was take the PD interval targeting pack, which I wrote originally, and up top I have the power duration curve. I have the range selected, which I always select 90 days in yellow MMP curve. But I have a hard-coded in MMP 21. I'm always looking at 21 days just to notice, just to see if anything looks odd in the cycle. 21 days, right? We tend to be 3 weeks on. So I'm just looking, does anything look odd? And only because I don't want to misprescribe the interval. And actually, more specifically, I don't want to review or misdiagnose the interview. And even I picked this athlete here at 4 minutes because you can see there's a little bit of gap right there and something they were doing here in the 90 days that's not in the 21 days. So that might give you a little heads up. But when it comes to workout duration, right, I always use the target duration of optimized intervals as a starting point. You guys, I have to hold on for 1 second. I'm sorry. 1 second. Okay. I left my little office heater and it's about 92 degrees here and I was going to pass out if I had to leave that on. So I had to turn it off real quick. So basically I'm utilizing these times as a starting point. First thing I do is round and then I might edit, right? So take max aerobic. Oh, 452, that's a 5 minute interval, right? Don't be overly precise. That means this athlete might gain from 5 minute intervals and that's a good duration. They might not be ready for that for some reason, or I don't think, so might I do 4? Yeah, that's, would I do them as 2 minute or something like that? No, I know the athlete needs to be in that range. I know the model has the most exertion. Go back to if I'm doing FRC building, pure FRC power, 44 seconds, I like 45. I don't see anything odd up here. That's what I do for timing. It really is that format. So then we talk about intensity. I'm sure you know where I'm going to go with intensity. Hey, look, I use the same chart, but now I'm using the power targets, right? Now, I also don't want to just trust data for the sake of trusting the data. I always validate, right? Always check. So I'm checking here. The target power has numbers, but I want to make sure I'm highlighted here at 4 minutes because it's a screenshot, but you get my point. In these time ranges, do I have any odd data? What if you had a big spike here, right? Or a big shelf here or something? You would know, maybe I need to edit, tweak my targeting a little bit because of that. So all I'm looking for is anything. I'm looking for what I don't know, right? What I might miss in this. And then there's my target power to plus or minus. So again, I start there. The first thing I do when I'm building it is I'll take a screenshot of this optimized intervals. And then I lay it up against these two charts, which is the same chart pack. And again, everything I'm showing you is basically in the PD interval target pack. I just added the 21 day. Then when I'm looking at targeting, right, I'm just using the curve under a curve. I've taught this from day one and I still do it. And I can absolutely tell you it's highly effective. I put in lines for time ranges just so I can track the time ranges. So it gives me an idea if I'm building, FRC, FTP, max aerobic, right? So I'm using the same 4 minutes here. Where I've really learned is the 90 percentile number if you look at a lot of research, to improve performance, you got to go hard, right? Eventually you got to turn up the watts, as Dr. Cogner would say. And, 90% is hard. In my book, that's the number. So to me, most of the intervals I'm targeting are 90 to 95%. 90% is kind of my core, but you'll see a strong, and I know why, so don't take it like it's a surprise to me. There's going to be a correlation between what you're seeing targeted here and the 90% number, right? But I want to double check. I want to make sure, because I might not use, for some reason, I might not use the 452 5-minute interval. Here I want to do 4-minute intervals. Curve under the curve, the 90% number becomes my target. Slightly tweak if I see some oddities or something like that. And I also always think about what did they do last time when I prescribed that. That's another reason when you don't change interval formats every single time, right? You can see progression from the athlete. They'll adapt. As soon as they go through the alarm phase and they start resisting, and look up general adaptation syndrome, you'll find a bunch of infographics. It'll make it nice and easy. That's what they do. So to me, that's my intensity prescription. I usually follow optimized intervals if I'm doing unique times because there's a 4-minute hill or I feel this athlete will benefit from that more specifically. I'm using 90%. Then I'm tracking that. If I'll go back and say, wow, did they do the number of intervals at 90% that I wanted? Yes. Okay. Put that in the bank and don't deviate off your 90%. One other thing that I do, though, just to make sure, because you see data anomalies at a time, like you guys, I work hard to keep my data clean. I run a last 90-day max of the top 3. I should rename this common. When I say common, it's the greatest 3. That's all I'm really looking at. And then I look at it for 60 seconds, 95. Because here you can see that one performance, that one yellow might be just one performance where maybe her power meter wasn't quite right. So you look at that 4 minutes, I'm looking at the average of the top 3, 95 and 90%. And it's basically, if you look at what it's giving, all pretty close. So I'm in the right ballpark, right? So my target at 90% works. There's a little bit of range. I feel pretty good about what I'm prescribing. That looks like, a fair amount of work to prescribe intervals, but it's actually really fast. You go to the one report. I make a decision of modality. What's my purpose of this training? That's often what I will do. And I already know that in this training cycle. I'm looking and making time-based decisions and target power decisions based off the optimized intervals. If they're not in the optimized, if I'm doing something outside of optimized, or if I want to validate, I'm using the 90% number. And then just to make sure I have no odd data, I'm checking an average of the top 3 just to make sure it is. Like I just said, I'm not going to load this chart to the library because we're just getting 100 versions of the same thing. The chart's name is PD Interval Target Pack, right? And all I added was optimized intervals to it and a simple report. So PD, it's interval. And I, by the way, you guys, I do this for each athlete. So sometimes I might put a unique report down the bottom, like if they're like what I do for a time trialist versus a mountain biker. I've got a couple of other targets where I might look at some normalized power stuff, but that's my point. Develop your process. This is really just validation. I'm just making sure there's no data anomaly. So let's talk about relief, duration, and intensity. So I want to do this really fast because as always I'm way over time frame because I'm not capable of doing anything in an hour. What I did in recovery time from intervals above FTP. So think about the purpose, right? Your Pmax power building. There's no Pmax capacity. If you're going to do Pmax, go max. Then your FRC power building, FRC capacity building, max aerobic power building, max aerobic capacity building, aerobic power intervals, and aerobic capacity intervals. So I give examples of the type of intervals. I've been doing it all, so I'm not going to read them all. Even I said here about this blurry line, you're kind of getting all in here. The recovery time though, right? If you're doing Pmax, 5 to 8 minutes, at times I would say out to 12, but more research is showing that really after 8, you're not getting much more power for recovering longer. So I've kind of evolved my thinking on rest, and I pretty much make 8 minutes the max now is my rest. Short sprints, 10 seconds. If I'm doing FRC power building, 45 seconds, max to very high effort. Again, same rest, 5 to 8 minutes. What I mean by progressive is after the first interval, it might only take you 5 minutes to recover. Well, the second one might take you 6, anywhere from 5 to 8. But then again, goes back to this idea of athlete feeling. So FRC capacity building, 60 seconds, So now I want capacity over power. 60 seconds, still pretty high, 90%. But the recovery ratio is fixed to 1 to 1.5. So what I mean by that, it might be 1 minute on or 1 minute off. At max, it's going to be 1 minute on and 90 seconds off. And it's fixed. I don't want them to progress it. Part of the point is I don't want them to recover. You don't want that system recovery, right? And you might do LSR or SSR in between. I would recommend the steady state recovery in between. This is more about maintaining a certain load on the system, building capacity, than it is about recovery. Here I would use LSR, just really slow, easy, super light pedaling. This is steady recovery, 40 to 50% of FTP. Max aerobic power building, 4 minutes on, as an example, max to very high, 90 to 95% of the curve, 1 to 1.5 ratio progressive. If I'm building power at VO2 max, I will rest from 1, sometimes out to 1.5. I tend to stick with 1 because that's, unless you're doing like really shorter VO2 max intervals, 1 is usually pretty much enough recovery. But if you need to go a little longer for that last one, I'm doing 4 minutes on and 4 minutes rest, and I need an extra 20, 30 seconds, fine. Because the goal is you're hitting the power. But then as soon as you go to capacity, same rule, but even more fixed here, 1 to 1. I don't want to, and by the way, you guys, these are max. So let's say you're building aerobic and you're doing 5 times 4 minutes, right? And that's 20 minutes worth of work, and you want to build more capacity. Doing a whole nother interval, that might be too much of a step up, right? Reduce the rest. Do 4 minutes on and 3 minutes off times 5. Reducing the rest will increase the ongoing strain the system is under. You don't recover as much, so it'll drop down the power a little bit, right, in that effort, but it'll force the body to go hard while it's not recovered. Just checking that. I know you guys see some, when you ask questions, you guys, if you ask them, I don't know if you can privately or send to all like I can, but some you see and some you guys don't. And aerobic intervals, I'm not going to do it. If you're doing FTP style work, 5 to 7, maybe even 5 to 10 minutes, if you're doing true FTP, a little supra, and then SST, 2 to 5, classic work there. Most people get it. I also sold this, and this is next to last slide. You know, what I could have done in the slide is put in LSR, LSR, SSR, but basically you're doing easy, light resistance during the recovery period. So when you're power building, you basically are barely spinning the pedals as your rest period. When you're capacity building, 40 to 50% of your threshold. This is why, you know, one of the things that gets really challenging, right? So you do your 4-minute intervals. What do most of your athletes do 4-minute intervals? They do them on a hill. And I do this too, and I have to break my habit of it because it's easy around here. I've got a perfect 3 and 4 and 5 minute hill called Butters. So it's like, I'm going to cruise over to Butters and do some intervals. That's about 6 to 7% perfect steady average for the up, right? But it takes away my option. It's enough grade that and it's got some twists in it. I can't pedal my way down, so I have to coast to recover. So it would behoove me to not do all of mine that way because I'm changing the rest relief protocol just because I've chosen to do them on the hill. So a lot of us do all of those intervals on a hill and we're always coasting in between. Send that athlete to a flat and have them make that power on flat and then do 40 to 50% in the off period, right, of threshold. Watch what they come back and report about fatigue. So I could have added that to this chart too, but there's a good tip. All right, I stole this again. And of course, I don't give credit because I forget where I stole it from, but I think it's really good. The advantage of the original interval was that it brought about very rapid and significant improvement in performance. Intervals basically started, right, with somebody had a 400-meter field, a bunch of lines, right, and lanes is the word. And then they marked 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters, and you would just sprint 100 meter and then light run. That came from running, light run 100 meters, then sprint 100 meters, then light run, and then turn around and do the same thing coming back. And you would do that day in and day out and day in and day out. And that was literally a training format. That format, when it was first invented, the disadvantages of just doing doing it that way, because you would see actually extremely rapid and significant improvements in performance. The disadvantage is that it would be incredibly monotonous, and rapid improvements in fitness were matched by an almost as quick loss of fitness on cessation of training. The reversibility principle kicks in really fast when you do that many days of intervals, that much work. It is now recognized that a longer lasting fitness can be achieved if the original interval training is combined with sufficient aerobic endurance development to stabilize. That's the word I love. Stabilize the improved cardiorespiratory response. One of the terms you've heard me use in other webinars is training resiliency. Training stabilization, metabolic stabilization, biological stabilization. That's what you're talking about in there, and is super interesting and a good point. So why I make that point, right, and I have Q&A coming up, why I'm making that point is I go back to the forest, right? The number one mistake I see, and you've read about it in articles, you've read about it in books, and the chances are you're still probably doing it, is you're doing too many interval, too many hard days a week, and therefore in a training cycle. Most athletes, 2 high-quality interval days done when they're well rested, meaning, let's call intervals here to be specific, at threshold and above, the more intense in that 8-week cycle. I mean, you could do tempo 4 days a week, or 5, even SST 4 days a week, if not more. But once you get more intense, you know, no more than 2 days a week, unless you're a highly developed, maybe there's cause for a third, right? A professional athlete usually can do 3. They need more stimuli. They need that bigger hit. And I know that goes a little against the 80-20 rule, but that's all right. I can live with that. It's 2 to 3. It depends on, you know, if you've done the base training right, that's 3. Most of us, this is how we convince ourselves we do our intervals, right? Well, I'm going to go hard Tuesday and Wednesday. Those are my interval days. And then, yeah, Saturday, I'm going to do that fast group ride. And Wednesday, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to knock out some pretty good endurance. Maybe I'll just go to the group ride, or maybe I'll just sneak in and, you know, 45 minutes of tempo. It'll be better for me. And then Sunday, I know I'm going to go longer and easier, but yeah, I'm going to do the first hour and a half with the group ride and then just go my own pace. Well, that ends up being 4 interval days a week, at least. Once you get into that mode, right, the thing that I see people do all the time is training mediocrity, because, and I know you've read it in every book, but you got to break that habit. You got to change it, right? The higher the quality of the intervals done 2 to 3 times a week over a 4 to 6 week cycle will bring you to the biggest peak possible. The in-between days you should be working on in medium to low endurance. If you're an 80-20 person, you're talking about zone 1. If you're a classic kind of person, you're talking about the middle point of endurance to just below it. Your endurance zone 2, don't go above the middle point, stay below it. You should be working on pedal stroke, efficient. There's other things that you can, not that pedaling makes you all that much faster, but there are some things that you should be working on in that phrase. But don't go too hard those days. Don't go to the group ride if you want to get to peak, because the quality of those, you only have that small handful of intense, if you want to peak, of high intensity interval workouts, you got to get them all right. That's the bigger mistake. It's not, did I do them as 4 times 5 or 7 times 3 versus mixed interval format versus steady. It's the fact that you put the rhythm of your training together incorrectly. It's the pattern of that training, right? And most of the answers are more in the pattern than they are in the training specificity. Or, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it that way. More than they are in the interval specificity. So I'm just going to tick down through questions I see. Tim, would not pedaling between max aerobic work not improve lactate tolerance, as it wouldn't engage the aerobic system to process it? Yeah, it would actually, again, because you're in between intervals, that lactate is actually going up. You are recovering, don't get me wrong, and it's whatever, but it's not like it just shuts off like you turned off the spigot. And your ability to deal with it while you're not under stress is actually not under the high stress of the interval, actually does teach the body how to tolerance. Let's just say in general it teaches it how to deal with lactate, because there's a lot of things happening in the system. on non-interval or between days, do you recommend a preferred workout IFTSS? Yeah, I was listening to the Velo News podcast the other day, and Trevor, he had a name for it. I do a lot of cadence and scales work in those days. So I would say the answer is medium, steady endurance, the middle of zone 2 or below, or again, if you're a polarized, you understand that, under your aerobic threshold or below. But during those days, you don't just go out and burn time, right? Do some work, get some things in, and get the work done that you need to do. I'll do a lot of mixed cadence work because, as I think it was BJ who said it earlier and somebody else pointed out, you'd be surprised that even at that lower power range, how, because you're changing up how you're recruiting muscle fiber, you're actually also, how to say it, you're dealing with your metabolic capability there and your metabolic control. And there's all types of other, and if you're looking at a lot of the new endurance research, like what you're releasing, calcium response, blah, 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 all these other things that are building. So yeah, I would basically do a mid zone 2 to low zone 2, maybe even high zone 1 endurance ride. I would try to keep in that aerobic threshold. You could use heart rate. About 65% of your max heart rate should be your ceiling, or 85% of your threshold heart rate. If you want to match power and heart rate. I'm much happier using power, but if you're a heart rate person and want to look at it, that will also give you some insight. In the taper period, do you think it's better to raise intensity, short TTs, above expected TT power, but reduce the number of intervals, or nail them and expected? Yeah, really good question. It depends where I'm at in my training. So the good general answer is keep the intensity the same and reduce the number of intervals. But if the athlete's really coming on form and peak is coming, squeezing in a little higher intensity is usually a good thing. But you got to be right, meaning you might be 12 days out for some reason and tapering too early and be like, wow, I'm flying. So you go out and you drill a couple really hard workouts. And yeah, you used to do 4 intervals and now you're doing 3 in that taper, or maybe even 2. But if you go crazy, you unleash the athlete, they could burn right through that peak right then and there. So you got to, the answer is yes, but in a well-controlled, smart manner. And you got to really know the athlete's just coming onto form, and you got to still don't let them go out and kill it. Peak, the most fragile state your body ever goes through, right, is peak. It's so sensitive to doing everything right. When you're on form and you're flying, man, it's so easy. You're so dangerous to yourself on form because you can, right? And because you can, you often do, which gets you in trouble. So it's a balance. What are your thoughts on the optimized FRC FTP intensive when the duration is above 20 minutes? Yeah, I'll see that at times. I often, though, see that is more of a result of the testing. I think I understand more. And if I don't have that question right, feel free to re-ask it. You know what? Here, actually, just to put it on the screen. So sometimes when you're when you're talking about this idea of FRC, FTP, it can really, I'm just trying to make sure I'm reading the question right. Yep. So the reality is it is, it generally tells us that you're making power, you can't sustain power in that sense. So that is the work that you need. When it goes past 20 minutes, it's pretty mentally tough, right? And can be fatiguing. And there's a way that you might, based off the athlete, tweak off the optimized interval. You might actually too, right? So one of the things you could consider doing for an athlete who maybe the reason that's so long is they aren't very fit or they're just coming into fitness, would you break it down by 2 times 12 with a really short rest in between? Sometimes you get creative, right? I know that's a crappy answer because it's like, Tim just told me do anything. But that is the type of interpretation. There's a lot of athletes who simply can't go that kind of hard for 24 minutes, right? They're just not really capable. So you do what you can. And then if they could do 12 minutes on, 2 minutes rest, 12 minutes on, the 2 minutes rest is a mental, and it's not the same result. It's not as good, but sometimes you use the data, use the information, take what you can get. If you did the mixed style intervals, how would you use PDC to set the on portion of the interval? Would you use the edge of FRC and FTP when build the progression of more on efforts? Yeah, I do use that. But at the end of the day, right, one of the things about mixed intervals, that's where it's really important that the athlete capability, go to the athlete I was talking about as an example, right? He just kills it. I mean, he goes really close, to his, so let's say we're doing 40 seconds on and 20 seconds off. He'll do 40 seconds at like 97, 98% of his 40-second power duration curve. So those, to me, I usually give the athlete that type of a starting target and let them wind it up. I use, when it comes to mixed intervals, reviewing historical performance is super important. It's never just one tool, never one clean answer, right? So this guy who does 40-20s, right, he kills them. Then I turn around, if I'm prescribing them to, one of my female pros, maybe all three of my female pros right now don't like those type of intervals. Actually one does. And they won't do them as well as steady state. And the percentage, the relationship, and the edge all change. I know part of it's physiological and part of it's psychological, but you have to adapt to both. So again, sorry, that's not a perfect answer, but it is an answer. Basically what I say when I prescribe those intervals is don't overthink it. Control the first one or two over, and then just basically you're going to go as hard as you can go anyway. At that stage, the body takes over and you're pretty much going as hard as you can go, in general. I don't mean, totally inside out hard, but I think you understand what I mean. Don't be overly precise. Don't let a really good workout with a general target, don't let that be the enemy of the perfect workout. Meaning, we look, should they go, if I'm doing 15 seconds on and 15 seconds off, or 20-10, the true Tabata format, right? To make that 20, the number of people who actually go through the trouble, right? Here's a classic example. If your athlete's pushing the interval button every 20 seconds, so they get the 20 on and the 20 off as intervals. I had one person used to do it all the time. They're losing power pushing the damn button. Just do the interval. Don't worry about the precision. Just go hard for 20 seconds and light for 20 seconds. So focus on it that way. Cool. I think I've got all the questions. Sorry about the overtime as usual. Hopefully that was helpful. If you didn't download the presentation, if you want it, go ahead and email me at info@WKO4.com. I could send it to you, but like I said, it's downloadable. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.